All right, we're back. All right, welcome. I'm Ben Boyce. This is, of course, the Dr. Junkie Show. And today I'm going to talk about how Big Pharma fucked it up for everybody by creating, shaping, and ramping up a war on drugs that's now more than a century old. But first, I owe you all some basic housekeeping. This podcast has been on, call it a slight hiatus. I've been teaching, I've been writing a lot. Honestly, I've been thinking about what to do with this project. Everything must come to an end someday, as the philosophers say, and that was actually on my list of options. Maybe it was just time to hang it up and shut this thing down. But two things happened that helped me decide to turn out at least a few more episodes. One, I got a ton of downloads and a bunch of emails from listeners that I really wasn't expecting. After I dropped my last episode and then sort of fell off the radar, my download numbers oddly went up by between 500 and 1,000%. They basically stayed there since. So, thanks, everybody. And two, I went to this really cool conference last week at Johns Hopkins University. It was about the prison writing archives and the current state of art and education programs inside U.S. prisons. And I wound up talking to some really cool people, many whom have been to prison themselves and who are doing some really cool things in those communities. I've also had a couple of my incarcerated students in those programs that I've talked about in the past. They've gotten out of prison over the last year, and some of them have actually wound up taking my on-campus college classes. These stories feel like they should be told. So during this season of the podcast, although I guess I don't actually break these up by season, but anyway, during this era of the podcast, I'm going to invite some of those people on to tell their stories. And of course, I'll still spend a lot of time talking about the war on drugs, crime and criminology, and the way the United States works as a system to cause many of the problems that it eventually blames on individuals. Now, I haven't actually sent out the invitations yet. It's on my list, I promise. I've been so busy with school and writing that I only just seriously started thinking about how to carry this project forward. But my goal is to have on a bunch of people that you may or may not have heard of, like David Carrillo, previously incarcerated teacher who got his master's degree while he was locked up, and then got hired as the first incarcerated teacher in the country to actively teach college classes in prison, from prison. They even paid him regular wages while he was in there. Now he's out after getting clemency from the governor. I'm also going to invite on two women who founded the Returning Artists Guild, or RAGS, and their stories are incredible. And I'm going to have at least one of my students who's currently on campus come on and tell his story of moving from being a student in prison to somebody on the outside world who's trying to finish their academic education. And here, I invite y'all to send in suggestions for other people who you think might make good guests for this season. I can't interview all of them. I probably can't even interview most of them. But I've received so many emails over the last few months during this hiatus, and so many of you have had good things to say, that I think it's worth asking for some of the audience's opinion on stuff like this. In other housekeeping, I recently published an article I wrote with a currently incarcerated ex-student of mine. It's called Crafting Convict Criminologist, an invitation to join us in prison. There's a link in the episode description. And it's about the changes we go through from incarcerated nothing burgers to people who are back in the free world. And how that change is kind of on us as incarcerated people. There's not a lot of help to get us through it. We're supposed to just figure out a way of moving through the progress of identity formation necessary to become a free citizen. But that's really hard to do in prison. So check that out if you want a good read. We also have the annual edition of Captured Words Free Thoughts coming out soon, and shortly thereafter I'll put together another audio podcast for that. So if you're on our mailing list for the paper copy of the magazine, look for that soon. And if you're not on the mailing list, why not? It's a free magazine. We publish art, poetry, and prose from incarcerated authors across the country every year, and we send it to anybody who wants a copy. And of course, if you have people inside prison who are working on things and looking for an outlet to get their name out there, send their work my way. All right, I think that's enough on the housekeeping. Let's get back to drugs. For the sake of making the argument today complete, let's start, way back at the beginning. Humans love drugs. We always have. Once upon a time, plants secreted chemicals that were poisons, like opium or cocaine, to prevent animals from eating them. Now, along the way, humans and some of our animal friends eventually figured out how to actually enjoy the effects of those plant toxins, those things that used to be poison. And the ability to alter our perception of the world, our feelings, our affect, just by taking a bite of a plant, well, no surprise that caught on. From there, as I've talked about a lot on this podcast before, humans got to work making those plants more potent and more poison, depending on your perspective. We've spent thousands of years now picking the biggest, strongest, and most potent plants out of every crop and planting the seeds from that plant, a process known as artificial selection. We've basically made evolution happen. The levels of cocaine hydrochloride in wild coca plants from South America, and the levels of opium in wild poppy strains that are in places like Afghanistan where different strains are farmed, the level in the wild plants is way lower than the strains that the farmers are growing right up the road. When you're growing a crop for size, you plant the strain that typically gets the largest and the best fruit. When you're looking for a virus-resistant plant, you grow the seeds of the plants from the crop before that showed the most antiviral properties. When you want a coca plant with the highest levels of cocaine or a poppy plant with the highest levels of opium, you grow a strain from the year before that had the highest levels. Artificial selection. So we've actually got a natural human tendency of sorts, both individually and culturally, as we'll see, to slowly but surely increase the potency of the drugs that we like to use. That kind of makes sense. If you want the maximum bang for your work as a farmer, you grow the plants that give you the most of what you want so you can sell them for the most profit. And for a long time, that was just fine. Farmers slowly increased the potency of their coca and poppy plants, and humans slowly adapted. We got used to it. But even though opium might have slowly become more pure, it was still always opium. Coca might have become more potent, but it was still always coca. And since it was a naturally occurring chemical that had been around for a long time, well, humans learned a long time ago how to get used to it. We adapted to it. So when coca is consumed by chewing the leaves, and when the sap from a poppy is swallowed or smoked, it does let the user catch a buzz. But neither of these drugs typically cause addiction when used in their natural forms. This is not true with their more potent forms, the things that we've made out of these chemicals, like cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyls. So let's speed the clock way ahead here and take it to where the war on drugs started, about 150 years ago. All humans might love drugs, but different cultures have always used their drugs differently. In China and East Asia, for example, smoking opium became popular in the late 1700s, largely because England was smuggling tons of it in and selling it super cheap using the front of the East India Trading Corporation to grow loads of it right on the border. That's why the opium wars actually happened. Eventually China had had enough, so they charged across the border into India one day, where the East India Company was growing, manufacturing, and storing all this opium that they were eventually shipping across the border into China, even though it was outlawed. And they burned a huge stash of British-owned opium, something like 1,000 tons. Every time I tell that story, I have to pause and just think about being there and smelling that much opium going up in smoke. What a waste. Anyway, China burns this British opium, delicious, and the British business owners reach out to the Queen and say, yo, you gotta back us up with military support. We owe you a bunch of money, we were gonna pay the debts that we owe you with this opium, and these jerks burned it. And the next thing you know, Britain is fighting 2 opium wars, trying to force China into legalizing opium. And the reason for that was simply money. Tea, porcelain, and silk that China was selling to the world throughout the 1700s, it was so much higher quality than anything else available, but China would only take silver as payment. That meant places like England, where merchants ruled the day, was basically delivering tons of silver across the ocean to China every year, and then in return, they were bringing perishable items that had to be constantly replaced back to the mainland. This was not going to work for very long. The Opium Wars were a result of England trying to balance that trade deficit. That's another episode for yet another day. Actually, I did that episode. I think it's called the Opium Wars. Enjoy. The point is, China was smoking their opium, while the US was largely consuming ours in tinctures sold by Sears or some other major corporation. And while Mexican immigrants were smoking their cannabis, US citizens were largely buying our cannabis tinctures for our menstrual cramps or headaches from catalogs. And while cocaine might have quickly become associated with minority groups in the South once the press started hyping the stereotypes to sell copies, it was originally consumed by all sorts of well-known and well-respected people, often mixed with booze no less. People like Queen Victoria, Pope Leo XIII, Thomas Edison, Ulysses S. Grant, our boy Sigmund Freud. He basically got a lifetime supply of cocaine when he agreed to start saying good stuff about it. And who can blame him? Uber coca, right? Anyway, they loved drugs. But people also love power. And along the way, as you can imagine, all of those legal, cheap, regulated natural drugs wound up causing people to become addicted, especially when the coca and the opium were replaced with things like morphine, heroin, and cocaine. And when your dad or husband or sister become addicted to some substance, the last thing you want to do is blame yourself. You'll do everything possible to not blame yourself. It can't have anything to do with you, because that would mean that people use drugs when they're struggling, or when they're looking for social connections that they can't find somewhere else. It might mean that you weren't doing enough to help the people in your social circle, and that's a really hard pill to swallow. Like Johann Hari said a long time ago, that would mean addiction is a disease of loneliness, of disconnection. No one wants to admit that they were part of what caused their friend or loved one to struggle with addiction. And they don't have to, because in our culture, way back at the beginning of the 1900s, politicians started to take advantage of those people whose family members and friends were struggling with addiction. And those politicians offered people exactly what they were looking for. A story that let the individuals and the culture at large off the hook completely by simply blaming the drugs that their loved ones were using. It isn't a miserable job or a loveless marriage that's causing your husband to drink away the paycheck. It's alcohol. It isn't an epidemic of systemic patriarchal violence that's causing men to abuse their wives and children. It's the booze. It wasn't you being racist when you felt like Mexican immigrants shouldn't be allowed here. It's the weed that these folks have been smoking that makes them immoral and lazy, according to the newspapers. It wasn't the leftover white supremacy that was causing white folks to hate black folks. Oh no. It was the news reports of, quote, cocaine-crazed Negroes who were immune to bullets fired from police revolvers. Those stories, which were way more popular than you'd think, Google them if you doubt it, they were so powerful at the time that they caused many Southern police departments to switch their pistols from .32 calibers to larger .38 calibers under the false belief that cocaine made black men bulletproof. But here's the thing. Prior to that, if you'd have told somebody that cocaine or cannabis caused immoral, dangerous, superhuman, evil behavior, many of them would have laughed at you. In the decades following the U.S. Civil War, drugs were so popular because people were really fucked up, both psychologically and physically. If you'd have told a kid that cocaine made users lose their minds, they would have had plenty of experience with grandpas and uncles who were using cocaine regularly to medicate, and that story wouldn't have made sense to them. Same with the other drugs. But when those Civil War vets started to die in large numbers around the turn of the century, around 1900, the stereotypes that were once undebatable were suddenly squishy. They could be reshaped. And at the perfect time, a number of politicians took advantage of that to build a war on drugs from scratch, to make us afraid of chemicals that we were never afraid of before. But what does any of this have to do with Big Pharma, you might be thinking? Oh boy, we're getting there. So it works like this today in the US. If you participate in the status quo system and support the necessary institutions with your money by following their rules, You can use whatever chemical you'd like as long as your doctor writes you a prescription for it. Want cocaine? No problem. Have your doctor write you a Ritalin prescription and you'll have the exact same action happening in your brain. Want heroin? Cool. Talk your doctor into writing you a script for Vicodin or Oxycontin or fentanyl. Want meth? Adderall's for you. And when you get these drugs, you'll be supporting a massive network of rule makers, rule checkers, rule enforcers, all taking a small cut as you pass by their checkpoint in the system, either through taxes that are paid to them by the state, or through direct services they're offering like medical care or pharmaceutical services. And of course, they all pay taxes. They all support the status quo too. They all abide by the rules of a much larger system than any one of them, and they risk punishment if they run afoul of it. We could go back and talk about why that system exists, but the short story is that around the turn of the 19th century, around 1800, the US had a battle of sorts between local medicine people who were hawking potions and spells and their competition, doctors who were trained in medical institutions. Of course, medicine was wild back then by any measurement, with lobotomies and injections of all sorts of toxic stuff still thought at the time to aid the recovery of unrelated diseases. But it was a start. And since those doctors back then were paying taxes, and since they operated in a largely capitalistic model, well, it's no surprise that the government chose their side and basically offered them a monopoly on all medical services as long as they were certified physicians. Witch doctors can't write you a prescription for Oxycontin, at least not legally. Now, if I get kicked out of the system, that regular go to the doctor, go to the pharmacy system, say I violate a rule, or if I fail to pay the right person in line because I don't have enough money, I'll have to resort to the streets to get those very same drugs. I'll have to go back to the equivalent of the old medical system. And when I get there, because it's operating outside the law, I'll immediately be treated very differently than I was when I played the game and jumped through the hoops of Big Pharma. I'm no longer a patient, I'm a criminal. I'm no longer medicating, I'm getting high. I'm no longer treating a condition, I'm creating one, addiction. That's how the public sees addicted people who use street drugs. As soon as we're not participating in the system that bleeds us dry, we become pariahs seen as the enemy. The illegal drug market also comes with all sorts of other terrible things that we've talked about before on this show, like contaminated products that aren't inspected by the FDA, violence as retribution for robberies since drug dealers can't call the police, drug dealers who press us to buy in bulk or even ask us if we want to add new drugs to our daily consumption patterns, groups of family, friends, and coworkers who push us away and lock us up when they find out we've been using all that tough love stuff. But it's actually worse than just that. Because we not only live in a culture at war with drugs, but also a culture that's capitalistic, to say the least. That means anytime something can be produced cheaper or with higher quality for the same price, it'll outsell the competition. And pharma, in addition to having a monopoly on chemicals that grow in plants and should be easy for anyone to access, has now ruined a lot of those chemicals. Think about that recipe for capitalism again. Reduce the cost and or increase the quality and you win. And one more piece, that pharma also needs new chemicals over time to keep their patents current. Otherwise, the entire pharma market can sell a drug. You don't want to sell cannabis or opium for this very reason, because you'd be competing with hundreds of other legitimate manufacturers when you could instead sell an allegedly new drug, something like Oxycontin or Ozempic, and then you can charge 10 times as much for it because you're the only person who's allowed to legally sell it. When you get a drug approved, that's how it works. You get a set amount of time to sell it exclusively before any so-called generics can be made for a cheaper price, before you can have any competition in the market. That's what drives pharma right now. The goal of research isn't to cure addiction or find a safer way to use cannabis because there's no money in that. You can't patent it. The goal is to find the next patentable chemical that can claim to fix a problem that was probably caused by some other issue within our culture that we don't want to acknowledge. That's pharma in the 2020s. Now those two forces, the desire to constantly update chemicals so you can maintain a patent, along with the pressure to reduce prices and increase quality over time, they've made the drug war way more dangerous than ever in the past decade. It started way before that, when pharma companies wanted to ship cocaine and opium to the US prior to the 1900s, and they realized that the precursor chemicals are bulky and fragile. Coca leaves and opium poppies take up a ton of space, and you gotta chew a lot of coca leaves and eat a lot of poppy sap to get high. So pharma started with the increased quality plus new chemicals equals patent recipe, and extracted cocaine from those coca leaves and opium from the poppy sap, and then they turned those things into patented chemicals. And of course, capitalism being what it is, they started sending free doses of these new drugs to people who would hype them, like our boy Sigmund Freud, who was one of the earliest people sponsored by cocaine. Of course, opium and cocaine are way stronger than the natural plants we'd been consuming for centuries, the coca bush and the sap from opium poppies. So people immediately struggled with addiction and health problems, not because of the drugs, but because of our capitalistic habit of increasing the potency and decreasing the price while ensuring a legal monopoly to increase profits. Our biology didn't have time to evolve alongside these new potencies of drugs. They were just dumped on us, and we paid the price. From cocaine, we eventually moved on to the next chapter, more potent chemicals like methamphetamine. Now, these offered a few advantages, the largest being that you don't have to grow fields full of poppy or coca plants to make it. Meth is made from synthetic ingredients, and it can be brewed in a back room in suburbia, as the news loves to point out. And then the same story with opium. From regular opium, we moved to morphine, hydrocodone, and a number of other opioids which were naturally derived from that poppy sap. But eventually pharma did what they always do. They looked for a way to manufacture a new original molecule that they could patent and that would mimic the effects of opium to reduce the cost of production. And they found a drug called fentanyl that doesn't require those big poppy fields to produce. There are actually dozens of fentanyl molecules, so I usually call it fentanyls on this show. But to keep this short, fentanyl is what you will probably get if you break your leg today and wind up in the hospital. It's cheaper than opium-based painkillers because, like meth, you don't need those fields full of poppies to produce it. And it's 80 times more potent than morphine, which means hospitals can keep a lot less of it in stock, and a little bit goes a long ways. Fentanyls also wear off a lot faster than morphine or other opioids, so, again with the capitalism, when patients who would otherwise have to stay in a hospital overnight following a surgery take fentanyl instead of morphine, they can often be released a lot quicker, even the same day, which saves the hospital a bunch of money. Capitalism is in every step of this process, including the invisibility of fentanyl's origins. Most people don't know that it came from pharma and is still commonly used in hospitals and doctors' offices today. So now we've got 100,000 plus people dying from alleged overdoses every year, and we've got a public understanding of the war on drugs that simply blames fentanyls, not the system that invented and popularized those drugs. Most of us think that if we just get rid of the fentanyls, the deaths would stop. But there are a lot of problems with this idea, like how do we get rid of a drug that doctors use all the time and that they don't want to stop using? Or the fact that attacking the supply of drugs has been the strategy for more than a century in the United States, and there's more drugs on the streets every year despite us spending billions of dollars to burn them before users can buy them. If we really want to end the drug crisis in the US, in the world, we have to attack demand. We have to figure out what's driving people to use problematically, and then we have to give them the resources they need to put and keep their lives in order. We have to give them alternative methods of finding that same source of fulfillment. That's largely what this season, again, not a season, but whatever, that's what the topic of this era of the show will be. Many of us who go through addiction and/or incarceration, we eventually find a way to put the pieces back together. And we often realize along the way that the system we lived in virtually guaranteed that we would turn to drugs the way we did and become addicted because no other source of comfort and support was offered when we needed it most. We were set up to fail by a system that insists on blaming us for those failures. People become addicted because of despair, hopelessness, depression, loneliness, alienation. If we want to fix addiction, that's where we got to start. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.